It's a heavy week, isn't it? The anniversary of the Parkland shooting, it always brings up a lot of difficult emotions and it makes you think about all the other tragedies like it, especially here in Florida.
Yeah, it does make you reflect, and you've specifically requested to dive deep into one of those other events. The GMAC shooting back in 1990, to learn more about James Edward Pough. The man responsible. You want to understand what led him to commit such a horrific act.
Right, and we've got a whole stack of sources. You sent over newspaper articles, court records, police reports, even personal accounts from people who knew him. It seems like everyone was trying to grasp the why behind it all.
It's a puzzle with a lot of missing pieces, but we can try to put it together. What's fascinating is that Pow's life, at least on the surface, seems so ordinary, but the sources reveal a darker undercurrent. Starting with a childhood marked by hardship.
Okay, so let's unpack that. What kind of hardships are we talking about?
Well, imagine growing up as one of 9 children in poverty in Jacksonville. His father left the family when he was young, leaving a void in his life. And to add to that, he struggled with asthma. It paints a picture of a vulnerable child facing a lot of adversity.
Yeah, definitely a recipe for a difficult upbringing. Do we see any early signs of trouble in those years?
We do. Even as a young man, he was involved with street gangs, which, exposed him to a world of violence. He had run-ins with the law, arrests for vagrancy, attempted robbery, and even an assault charge for attacking a construction worker who owed him a quarter.
Attacking someone over a quarter. That seems extreme.
It does, doesn't it? It suggests impulsiveness, a quickness to anger, and maybe a disregard for the consequences of his actions, and this was just the beginning. A pivotal moment occurs in 1971 when he was 23 years old, an incident that seemed to cast a long shadow over the rest of his life.
Right, this is when he kills his best friend David Lee Pender during an argument. What do our sources tell us about this event?
It started with an insult, a heated exchange. Pender called Pow's girlfriend a bitch. And that seemed to be the trigger. Pow grabbed a gun from his girlfriend's purse and shot Pender not once but 3 times.
Wow, that detail about the gun being in his girlfriend's purse adds a whole other layer to this. It wasn't premeditated, but it shows how easily violence could erupt in his life.
It does. And it's crucial to note that while he was initially charged with murder, the charge was reduced to manslaughter. He pleaded guilty to aggravated assault and received 5 years of probation.
Probation for taking a life. That's pretty lenient, especially considering his prior offenses.
It might seem shocking now, but that was the judgment at the time. And here's where it gets really interesting. The court ruled that because of his violent history, Pow should never be allowed to own a gun.
That seems like a sensible precaution. So how did he get the gun he used in the GMAC shooting years later?
That's a critical question, and the answer revealed a tragic failure of the system. The court's ruling never made it to the police. There was a communication breakdown, and as a result, years later, Pow was able to legally purchase firearms.
Wow, a missed opportunity to potentially prevent a tragedy? It makes you wonder what might have been different if that information had been shared.
It's a chilling thought, and it underscores the importance of communication and accountability within the legal system, especially when it comes to preventing gun violence.
So we have this troubled childhood, this early act of violence with lasting consequences. But then there's a gap of almost 20 years before the 1990 shooting spree. What happens in Powell's life during those years?
On the surface, he seems to lead a relatively quiet life, working various jobs, mostly as a laborer. He gets married, but the sources reveal that his life was far from idyllic. He struggled financially, and those struggles would ultimately play a key role in his downward spiral.
Interesting. So these financial difficulties were more than just everyday money problems. They actually contributed to his eventual breakdown.
It seems that way. He was having trouble making payments on his car, a 1988 Pontiac Grand Am. It was eventually repossessed by GMAC, the very company where he would later commit the mass shooting.
That's a chilling connection. Do the sources indicate how he reacted to this financial setback?
He received a hefty bill from GMAC for over $6,000, which would be over $13,000 in today's money. This was a significant burden for someone already struggling. And remember, he was still haunted by the death of his friend.
So we have this incident from his past that he never fully recovered from, coupled with mounting financial pressure. Was there anything else contributing to his unraveling?
Tragically, his mother, to whom he was very close, passed away 3 years before the shooting. This loss seems to have been a breaking point for him. He became increasingly reclusive, withdrawn from the world around him.
It sounds like he was carrying a lot of pain both from his past and his present circumstances. Did this manifest in any outward signs of distress?
Yes, there are reports of him saying he had nothing to live for, that he would take someone with him when he left this world. There were even instances of violent outbursts, particularly towards his wife, ultimately leading to their separation.
So a sense of hopelessness combined with escalating aggression? This is where the story starts to take a darker turn, right? Because it's around this time that he purchases the M1 carbine used in the GMAC shooting.
Exactly. He buys it from a pawn shop about 2 months before the spree. It's almost as if he's making a conscious decision to embrace the darkness that's been building inside him.
It's a chilling realization knowing that the pieces were falling into place for this terrible tragedy. But before we get into the events of the shooting itself, I think it's important to pause and reflect on what we've learned so far.
Absolutely. We've uncovered a complex portrait of a man grappling with a troubled past inner demons and mounting external pressures. It's a reminder that even seemingly ordinary lives can hold hidden depths of pain and despair.
And it raises questions, doesn't it, about the ripple effects of trauma, the missed opportunities for intervention, and the complex factors that contribute to these kinds of tragedies.
It certainly does, and it's these questions that we'll continue to explore as we delve into the events of June 17th and 18th, 1990, the days that would forever change the lives of so many.
So we left off with Pough seemingly reaching a breaking point. Lost his mother, his marriage is falling apart, he's facing serious financial stress, and now he's off with this powerful weapon. It's like a recipe for disaster.
It truly is, and on June 17th, 1990, that disaster begins to unfold. Late that night, just before 1 a.m., Pough sets out on his rampage.
And his first victim is Louis Carl Bacon, shot twice in the chest. The sources describe it as a seemingly random attack on the street. Do we have any insights into why Bacon was targeted?
Sadly, no investigators couldn't find any connection between Pough and Bacon. It appears to be a case of senseless random violence, which makes it even more terrifying. Just minutes later, he attacks Doretta Drake, who is talking with friends in a parking lot.
Yeah, the details of that attack are particularly brutal. He hits Drake with his car before shooting her.
You're right. It's a disturbing escalation of violence. He hits her with his car, she falls to the sidewalk, and then he gets out and shoots her in the head. It's a level of aggression that's difficult to comprehend.
And it doesn't stop there. Pough then drives around, asks two teenagers for directions, and then shoots and wounds them as well. It seems like he's on a mission to inflict as much pain as possible.
What's striking is the randomness of these attacks. There's no apparent motive, no connection between the victims and Pough. It suggests a level of rage and detachment that's truly chilling.
So 4 victims in a single night. What happens next?
The morning of June 18th, Pough robs a convenience store. He tells the clerk he has nothing to lose, a statement that takes on a whole new meaning, knowing what we know now.
That's right, we're getting a glimpse into his state of mind, a sense of desperation and nihilism. What happens after the robbery?
He visits his mother's grave. It's a poignant detail considering the profound impact her death had on him. It's almost as if he's seeking some kind of solace or closure, or perhaps even a twisted form of permission for the terrible acts he's about to commit.
And then he makes that chilling call to his supervisor?
Yes, in a calm, almost detached voice, he informs his supervisor that he won't be coming to work that day because he has something else to do.
Knowing what's to come, it's hard not to feel a shiver run down your spine. What was going through his mind at that moment? Was it a final act of defiance, a twisted sense of obligation, or perhaps even a warped attempt to protect his colleagues from what he was about to do?
It's a question that haunts us, doesn't it? The fact that he made that call suggests some level of awareness, some recognition of the gravity of his actions, and yet he proceeds with his plan.
And that plan leads him straight to the GMAC office.
Exactly. At around 10:44 a.m., Pough arrives at the GMAC building armed with his M1 carbine, a .38 caliber revolver, and a chilling amount of ammunition. He walks in through the front door and immediately opens fire.
The sources you provided include eyewitness accounts from those who were inside the GMAC office that day. It must have been absolute chaos.
Imagine the terror. You're going about your workday and suddenly gunfire erupts. There's screaming people diving for cover, desperately trying to escape the hail of bullets.
It's a scene that's sadly become all too familiar in our society, a stark reminder of the indiscriminate nature of gun violence.
Pough doesn't hesitate. He kills Julia Burgess and wounds David Hendricks at the front counter. He then moves methodically through the office, shooting people at their desks, some even while they're trying to hide.
The sources list the names of those who lost their lives that day: Drew Woods, Cynthia Perry, Barbara Holland, Janice David Sharon Hall, Lee Simonton, Denise Highfill, and Ron Echeverria. And Jewel Belote, who was shot and clung to life for 9 days before tragically succumbing to her injuries.
9 lives extinguished, countless others forever scarred by the trauma of that day. It's a staggering loss, a testament to the devastating power of rage and unchecked violence.
Yeah, it's hard to even fathom the level of fear and desperation those people must have felt. Were any of them able to escape?
Some employees did manage to flee through a back door, but many were trapped inside, forced to confront a nightmare they could never have imagined.
What finally brought Pough's rampage to an end?
After a horrifying 2 minutes during which he fired an estimated 28 rounds, Pough takes his own life.
So the carnage ends the way it began, with an act of self-destruction. It's a tragic culmination of a life spiraling out of control. But the story doesn't end there, does it? Investigators uncover some chilling details in the aftermath.
You're right. In Pow's car, they find a loaded 9mm pistol, more ammunition, and 12 pieces of nylon rope, each about 2 feet long. It raises unsettling questions about what his initial plans might have been.
The ropes are particularly disturbing. It suggests the possibility of a hostage situation, something even more sinister than the shooting spree itself.
Yes, and that possibility adds another layer of complexity to this already tragic case. It makes you wonder what prompted him to deviate from that apparent plan and instead opt for such indiscriminate violence. What was the tipping point?
It's a question we may never be able to answer definitively, but there's one more detail from the investigation that I find particularly haunting.
You're referring to the calendar found in Pow's ransacked home, the one with 2 dates circled in red.
Exactly. May 8th, the day he killed his friend back in 1971, and June 18th, the day of the GMAC shooting. It's as if those two events, separated by almost 2 decades, were somehow intertwined in his mind.
That connection is certainly chilling. It suggests a profound and lasting impact of that first killing, a burden of guilt and trauma he carried with him for years. Perhaps in his mind, the GMAC shooting was, in a twisted way, a continuation or culmination of that earlier tragedy.
It's a disturbing thought, but it does offer a potential glimpse into the dark recesses of his psyche. We see the echoes of his past reverberating into the present, shaping his actions, and ultimately leading him down a path of destruction. It's hard to wrap your head around it. You know, the sheer devastation of that day, 9 lives lost, a community traumatized, and a nation once again grappling with, the horrific consequences of gun violence. And the GMAC shooting, it wasn't just a local tragedy, right? It resonated far beyond Jacksonville.
You're absolutely right. It sparked a national conversation, much like Parkland did years later, about gun control, mental health, and societal responsibility. And we see these same debates play out time and time again. And it's a painful reminder that as a society, we're still struggling to find answers.
The news coverage from that time is fascinating. You see these editorials and opinion pieces, arguing for stricter gun control measures, while others emphasize the needs for better mental health resources. It's a debate that continues to this day, and it seems like we're still searching for that additional balance between individual rights and public safety.
It's a complex issue with no easy solutions. And when you delve into the specifics of Pow's case, it raises even more questions. The fact that he was able to legally purchase firearms despite a court order prohibiting him from doing so, it's a glaring example of, systemic failure.
Right, and it's hard not to wonder if things could have been different, if that information had been shared, if someone had intervened, if he had access to better mental health care. Could this tragedy have been prevented?
It's a question that lingers long after the headlines fade. Could we have stopped it? And it's impossible to say for sure, but it's crucial to examine these missed opportunities and learn from them. Perhaps by addressing these systemic issues, by strengthening our safety nets, and by fostering a culture of awareness and support, we can prevent future tragedies.
You've done a deep dive into a lot of dark topics, and I imagine that could be emotionally draining. How do you stay grounded when you're surrounded by so much tragedy and despair?
That's a good question. It's important to remember that amidst the darkness, there are always glimmers of hope. After tragedies like the GMAC shooting, we often see communities come together to demand change, to support victims, and to advocate for policies that might prevent future violence. Those efforts, no matter how small, are what keep me going. They remind me that even in the face of immense pain, there's a collective will to create a better world.
It's a good reminder that each one of those lives lost represents a ripple effect of grief that extends outwards, touching families, friends, and entire communities. It's our responsibility to honor those victims by continuing to have these difficult conversations and by working towards a future where such tragedies are unthinkable.
I couldn't agree more. By remembering the victims, by grappling with the complex questions surrounding these events, and by refusing to let these tragedies fade into obscurity, we keep the conversation alive, and that's where change begins.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored the life of James Edward Pough, delved into the factors that contributed to his descent into violence, and examined the tragic events of the GMAC shooting. We've also grappled with some tough questions about gun violence, mental health, and societal responsibility.
It's a lot to process, but knowledge is power. The more we understand these complex issues, the better equipped we are to make a difference.
So to our listener, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. It wasn't easy, but it was important. And remember, the conversation doesn't end here. Take what you've learned, share it with others, and continue to engage in these crucial discussions.
Because together we can work towards a future where tragedies like the GMAC shooting are not just unthinkable but impossible.